The crown was a lie. A heavy, cold, unforgiving lie pressed down on his brow, and he was tired of living it. He traced the gilded wolf emblem, its ruby eyes seeming to mock him from the polished surface of the great oak table. It wasn't him. That stoic, powerful beast of legend? No. He felt hollow. More importantly, he felt utterly, crushingly alone. The silence in his royal chambers was a living thing, a predator that coiled around his chest and squeezed until his breath came in shallow bursts. It was a silence filled with the whispers of his council, the rustle of treaties he didn't trust, and the ever-present threat from the Shadowfen pack on their borders. What was it all for? This power, this throne. If his own soul felt like a barren wasteland? Tonight was the mating ceremony, a night that should have been filled with hope. But for him, it was just another performance, another duty, another act in the grand play of being the Alpha King. He had to find a Luna, they said, for the good of the pack, for stability. But their words were hollow because he saw the truth in their hungry eyes. They didn't want a Luna. They wanted a pawn, a high-born female from a powerful family to cement an alliance, a beautiful ornament to drape on his arm. They wanted a wolf who would look at this crown, this lie, and love it, instead of the man forced to wear it. And the very thought was poison in his veins. So he had a plan, a desperate, foolish, last-ditch plan born from sleepless nights and a heart starved for something, anything real. He wouldn't be going as the king. In fact, he wouldn't be going as anyone at all. He ran a hand over his face, the rough scruff on his jaw a small rebellion against the perfectly groomed monarch he was supposed to be. His wolf, a great silver beast that was the pride and terror of the Silver Moon Pack, paced restlessly within him. It knew the truth, too. It felt the emptiness. It yearned for its other half, a yearning that was a constant burning ache behind his ribs. He had to do this because the pack deserved a Luna of substance, not a polished statue. More than that, he deserved to be chosen. Just once. For himself. Moments later, he pushed away from the table, his decision a cold, hard stone in his gut. He crossed the vast chamber, his bare feet silent on the cold marble, and pulled open a hidden wardrobe. Inside, past the royal silks and ceremonial armors, was a bundle of rough, homespun cloth. It smelled of earth and sweat and honesty, a servant's rags. That night he would not be their king, he would be nothing. And in that nothingness he prayed he would finally find everything.
The kitchens were a special kind of hell, a hot, loud, chaotic hell that smelled of roasting boar, burnt onions, and the sharp, clean scent of lye soap that never quite left the skin. Leandra kept her head down, her hands moving with a speed born of years of practice, scrubbing a pot with a focus that blocked out the world. It was safer that way, to be invisible, to be a ghost in the steam and clatter. But then Brina, her voice as sharp as a dropped knife, slammed a tray down beside her. "Did you see Lady Celine's gown? Woven with moon-silver threads, they say. She's determined to catch the king's eye tonight. Not that it'll be hard. He'll probably just pick the one whose father has the most land." Elspeth, a girl whose face was permanently pinched in a sneer, laughed. "He'd be a fool not to. What else is there to choose? A pretty face? That fades. Land is forever." She jabbed a wooden spoon in Leandra's direction. "Mind your hands, Leandra. Wouldn't want to get any of that on the serving platters." Without thinking, Leandra pulled her hands back, tucking them into the folds of her worn apron. Her cheeks burned with a familiar shame. The scars, a pale, tangled web of tissue across her knuckles, throbbed as if they were fresh. She didn't say a word. She never did. Speaking only ever brought trouble. Deep down, she knew the truth. In this palace, a servant girl's voice was worth less than the dirt she scrubbed from the floor. Elspeth sighed dramatically. "Honestly, I almost feel sorry for him. Trapped. Having to marry some power-hungry she-wolf who probably purrs like a kitten to his face and sharpens her claws behind his back. Can you imagine?" Maybe it was fate that made her look up in that moment. Her gaze drifted past the chaos to the single, grime-streaked window that looked out toward the great hall. She couldn't see anything, of course, but she could imagine it. The glitter, the pomp, the lonely king at the center of it all, a prize to be won. And for the first time, she didn't feel envy for the nobles or fear of her superiors. She felt a strange, aching pity for him. A king she'd never met, a man she'd never see. Yet in her heart, she felt the echo of his loneliness. She didn't know what scared her more, the noble's ambition or the king's solitary fate. Before she could move, the great bell tolled, its deep, resonant clang vibrating through the stone floor. The ceremony was beginning. As the sound faded, a shiver traced its way down her spine. A premonition, cold and sharp, that this night would change everything.
It was worse than he had ever imagined. The great hall, a place of power and beauty, now felt like a gladiatorial arena, and he was the sacrifice. He stood in the shadows, the rough-spun tunic itching against his skin, his hair artfully dirtied. He was just another face in the crowd of low-ranked, unmated males, and they were all invisible. Lady Anya, her nose held so high he was surprised she didn't trip, swept past him with a look of utter disgust, her eyes fixed on a burly alpha near the throne. Lord Valerius's daughter, barely a woman, giggled with her friends and pointed at the dirt on his boots, her laughter like shattering glass. One after another, the high-born females passed him by. They didn't just ignore him, they mocked him. A noble even spat on the floor near his feet, a deliberate, calculated insult to show his own alpha that he, too, held no value for the weak. His wolf, the proud silver beast of his bloodline, didn't rage. No. It did something far worse. It whimpered. It shrank back into the deepest part of his soul, wounded in a way no physical blow ever could be. With every sidelong glance, with every cruel whisper, his desperate hope withered and died. His flaw, his deepest, most secret fear, was being laid bare for all to see. Without the crown, he was worthless. His plan wasn't just foolish, it was masochistic. He had willingly stepped into this pit just to prove how broken he truly was. He saw their greed, he saw their ambition, he saw their utter lack of soul. They were vultures, all of them, circling a throne they didn't understand, and a man they had no interest in knowing. He had to clench his fist to stop his own power from leaking out, from revealing the lie. It was a bitter, painful irony, because the very power they craved was the only thing stopping him from tearing their contemptuous sneers from their faces. The rage was there, a cold, simmering fire, but beneath it was a grief so profound, it threatened to bring him to his knees. He was a king of thousands, and he had never been more alone. Truth be told, there was nothing left for him here. He took a step toward the shadows, his heart a stone in his chest, ready to embrace the lonely reign he was cursed to endure. But then, a voice so small, so hesitant, it should have been swallowed by the vastness of the hall. Instead, it cut through the noise, through the pride, through the pain. It was a thread of silver moonlight in a starless night. A voice he'd never heard, yet his soul seemed to answer it with a resounding thud in his chest. In the span of a breath, everything stopped, and it asked a question that would shatter his world.
Her body moved on instinct. One moment, she was a ghost in the shadows, a creature of dust and silence. The next, she was walking. Her worn leather shoes made no sound on the polished marble floor, and yet every step felt like a thunderclap that shook her own bones. The air thickened, growing heavy and charged, pressing in on her until she could barely draw a breath. Without thinking, she pushed through the glittering sea of nobles, their expensive perfumes and condescending glares washing over her unnoticed. Her world had tilted, narrowed to a single point. The defeated slump of a man in rags, his soul so wounded she could feel it from across the hall. The moment their eyes locked, the universe seemed to hold its breath. Before the words left her lips, she felt the sheer, terrifying madness of what she was about to do. This was a violation. A servant did not speak at the mating ceremony. A servant did not exist. To do this was to invite ruin, to beg for a punishment she knew all too well. Her scars, the ones hidden beneath her sleeves, the ones etched on her soul, screamed a warning. "Remember the last time," they whispered. "Remember the pain." But then she saw the utter desolation in his eyes, a loneliness so profound it mirrored the deepest parts of her own heart. And her wolf, a creature she rarely felt, pressed forward. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. "Are you okay with me being your mate?" As the silence stretched, it became a physical weight. It was absolute, complete. Not a single goblet clinked, not a single silk dress rustled. For one single heartbeat, the world shifted, and then it shattered. A gasp ripped through the hall, a collective sound of shock so sharp it was like an intake of breath before a scream. What followed was a wave of noise, hissing whispers, incredulous laughter, and the low, angry growl of an alpha whose daughter had been slighted. Hundreds of eyes, like glittering, merciless jewels, swiveled to pin her in place. The weight of their stares was a physical blow, hot and heavy and suffocating. Her cheeks burned with a shame so intense it felt like fire blooming beneath her skin. Panic, cold and slick, tried to claw its way up her throat. Why did she do that? What madness had taken hold of her? She didn't know what scared her more, the fury of the entire noble court, or the answer from the man still looking at her with an expression of stunned disbelief.
Time stood still. The voice, that silver thread of a voice, wrapped around his frozen heart and squeezed. In that moment, the mocking laughter of the court, the weight of his crown, the entire suffocating world he lived in, it all dissolved into nothing. There was only her, a servant girl. Her apron was stained, her hands were trembling, and her eyes, her wide, terrified, astonishingly brave eyes were fixed on him. She wasn't looking at a king or a beggar. She was looking at a soul. And she was asking if it was okay. As if pulled by a string, his own soul answered. The whimpering wolf inside him, the beast that had been cowering in shame, rose up. It did not snarl. It did not roar. It let out a deep, soul-shaking purr of pure recognition. Mate. The word was not a thought. It was a fire that erupted in his blood, a primal certainty that slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. The constant gnawing ache of loneliness he'd carried his entire life didn't just fade, it was annihilated, replaced by a wave of warmth so profound it made him dizzy. He felt it, etched in fire across his very being. This was it. This was the other half of his soul he had stopped believing existed. He had to have her because she was the only person in the world who had looked at his nothingness and seen everything. He had to claim her because his wolf was already clawing at his chest, demanding he cross the floor and sink to his knees before her. He had to accept because rejecting her would be the same as ripping his own heart out. The nobles, their faces twisted in masks of outrage and disgust, were just buzzing insects. Their opinions were less than dust. In the span of a breath, his desperate, foolish plan had worked in a way he had never dared to imagine. So, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, he was more than okay. He was saved. But then, the world came rushing back in. He saw the shift in the crowd, the sneers hardening into genuine menace. The palace guards, their faces grim, began to move toward her. A beat later, the dreamlike state shattered, replaced by a cold, protective fury. They would not touch her. He would tear them apart with his bare hands before he let them lay a single finger on the woman who had just healed a wound he didn't even know he had. Before either could speak, the guards were upon her.
The moment was broken by rough hands grabbing her arms. A gasp tore from her lips as she was yanked backward, her feet stumbling on the slick marble. The man's face, the shock on his face turning to something fierce and protective, was the last thing she saw before her world became a blur of angry, sneering faces. Lady Celine stood nearby, her beautiful face a mask of cold, reptilian fury. "Insolent filth!" Celine hissed, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. She dares to mock our most sacred traditions." The words were like stones, and the crowd eagerly picked them up to hurl at her. "Shameful! Punish her! Banish her!" They dragged her from the hall, not through the grand doors, but through the servants' exit like a piece of trash being discarded. Back in the kitchens, the other servants who had been her peers only moments before now backed away, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and contempt. No one would associate with her now. She was tainted. Brina, the servant who had been gossiping earlier, spat on the floor near her feet, the very same insult the nobles had given the disguised king. Irony was a bitter pill to swallow. Her superior, a stout woman named Mistress Theron, grabbed her chin, her fingers digging into the skin like claws. "You have brought shame upon this house," she growled, her voice low and dangerous. "You are a fool, girl, a complete and utter fool." Without another word, Leandra was shoved into the darkness of a small, windowless pantry, and the door was bolted shut. The darkness was absolute. The silence roared in her ears. She slid down the rough wooden door, her whole body trembling, and finally let the tears come. Hot, silent tears of terror and humiliation. The darkness was familiar. The punishment was familiar. Deep down, she knew the truth. She had just signed her own death warrant. Yet, as she huddled in the cold, clutching her chest, she felt something else beneath the fear. A phantom warmth. A faint, shimmering echo of connection to the man in the hall. He had nodded. In the middle of all that chaos, he had looked at her, and he had nodded. She didn't regret it. She didn't. No matter how hard she tried to feel the terror, that single memory was a tiny, defiant spark in the suffocating darkness. She had reached for a soul in pain, and for one breathtaking moment it had reached back. The question now was, had she just found her mate, or had she merely chosen the man who would be forced to watch her die?
His rage was a silent, white-hot inferno. The guards had taken her, his mate. He watched them drag her away, his entire being screaming to unleash the silver wolf and tear the hall apart. But he couldn't. Not yet. To reveal himself now, in a rage, would be to play directly into his enemy's hands. They would call him unstable, unfit. More importantly, they would see her as a weapon used against him, and that would put her in even greater danger. He needed to be smart. He needed to be the beggar, not the king. So he forced the inferno down, banking the flames behind a mask of indifference, and melted back into the shadows. He spent the next hour like a ghost, haunting the servants' corridors. The scent of her, wildflowers and a quiet sorrow, was a thread he followed through the maze of stone passages. His wolf paced at the front of his mind, a frantic, desperate beast, whining her name. Find her. Find our mate. He had to force his way through knots of gossiping servants, their whispers like wasps. Locked in the dry pantry. Serve her right. The words were fuel on the fire, but he kept his head down, his face hidden. Eventually he found it. A heavy iron-bolted door in a forgotten corner of the lower levels. The air here was cold, still. Her scent was strongest here. She was inside. Without another word to the guard he'd subtly intimidated into leaving his post, he slid the heavy bolt. The sound was a deafening thunk in the silence. The door creaked open, revealing a sliver of darkness that felt colder than the stone around it. "Leandra," he whispered, his voice rough. A small shuffle. Then she was there, a silhouette in the gloom, her face pale and stained with tears. Her eyes widened when she saw him. Not the king. Just the man from the ceremony. Before she could move, he was inside, shutting the door behind them. The darkness was absolute. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Why did you do it? You saw them. You heard them. Why would you choose the lowest of the low?" Her answer came out on a shaky breath, full of a simple, devastating honesty that stole the air from his lungs. Because no one else would. Because I know what it feels like to be scorned while everyone watches. In the quiet that followed, he understood. It wasn't about status or power. It was about compassion. A core of goodness so pure it shone like a star in the murky darkness of his world. He reached out, his calloused hand finding hers in the black. Her skin was cold. "This is not the end," he promised, his voice a low growl of pure conviction. "Meet me in the palace gardens by the weeping moon willow at midnight, please."
Come morning, the pantry door was unbolted and she was put to work. Her punishment was not to be idle in the dark, but to be humiliated in the light. She was assigned the most degrading tasks: scrubbing the kennel floors, polishing the boots of the visiting nobles, hauling buckets of refuse until her arms ached and her back screamed in protest. Every task was a reminder of her place. Every sneer was a stone thrown at her spirit. She endured the day because the night promised the gentle touch and quiet voice of the man who had found her in the dark. He was her secret, her single flickering flame of hope. That afternoon, the flame almost went out. As she was scrubbing the main entryway steps, a shadow fell over her. Lady Celine. Flanked by two other noblewomen, she looked down at Leandra with an expression of bored cruelty, as if examining an interesting bug just before crushing it. "Well, well," Celine purred, her voice dripping venom. "The little kitchen mouse who thinks she can play with wolves. Tell me, did your beggar mate come crying to you in the night? Or has he already found a gutter more comfortable than your arms?" Before she could even think to stand, one of Celine's friends kicked the bucket of dirty water, sending a foul wave across Leandra's lap and the freshly cleaned steps. They laughed. It was a high, sharp sound that made her flinch. "You are nothing," Celine said, stepping closer, her silk slipper pressing down near Leandra's hand. "You are a stain. And stains. Get scrubbed out." She didn't know what scared her more, the hatred in Celine's eyes or the cold, calculated promise behind her words. With every heartbeat, she just knelt there, head bowed, and took it. She took the humiliation. She took the laughter. She took their scorn, because fighting back would only make it worse. That night, she fled to the gardens. The air was cool and smelled of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth. Beneath the moonlight, the world felt clean again. And he was there. He waited for her under the silver leaves of the weeping willow, and the moment she saw him, the tightness in her chest eased. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, his gaze taking in her soaked dress and the red scrape on her arm where she'd fallen. Without a word, he gently took her arm, tearing a strip of cloth from his own tunic to clean the wound. His touch was warm and steady. In that moment, she didn't feel like a servant. She felt cherished. He was her sanctuary. He was her strength. And as he held her hand under the watchful eye of the moon, she knew she would endure anything, as long as she had this.
He had to end it, this secrecy, this suffering. For days he had met her in the gardens, and with every stolen conversation, the bond between them, something that had sparked in an instant, now deepened into a cord of tempered steel. He saw her strength. He saw her quiet grace. He saw the wounds, both new and old, that she tried so hard to hide. And he saw the toll his own cowardice was taking on her. He was hiding in rags while his mate was being treated like one. His wolf snarled at the injustice, at the shame, at his own calculated inaction. So he made a decision. He would reveal himself at the next full moon gathering. It was a risk, but it was better than letting her break under the strain. But then, his enemies moved first. As if fate demanded it, the council, spurred on by a fiery speech from Celine's father about tradition and purity, decided to act. They would make an example of the servant girl who dared to disrupt the mating ceremony. The moment they dragged her into the ceremonial circle, a red haze fell over his vision. He stood in the crowd, still disguised, every muscle in his body coiled as tight as a whip. Leandra stood there, small and trembling, but her head was held high. They threw insults at her. unworthy, filth, arrogant. Each word was a physical blow to him. He felt it in his teeth, in his gut. His wolf was a raging tempest, clawing at the inside of his skin, begging to be released. Let me protect her, let me tear them apart. He held on by a thread, just a little longer. But then, a pompous lord, eager to prove his loyalty to purity, stepped forward. She has mocked the goddess, he roared. She must be cleansed by pain. In his hand was a long, thin whip. The crowd roared its approval. Before she could move, before anyone could intervene, he raised his arm, the whip a black serpent against the torchlight. That was it. The thread snapped. Without thinking, Zevran moved. He was a blur of motion shoving past shocked nobles. He didn't stop until he stood between Leandra and the whip. Enough! The word was a growl, a promise of death, and in one sweeping motion he threw off the servant's cloak. Power erupted from him, a tangible, crushing wave of pure alpha dominance. The air crackled, the torches flared, gasps of shock and terror ripped through the hall as a king was revealed. Every wolf in the room, from the highest noble to the lowest guard, was forced to their knees by the sheer, undeniable weight of his aura. The lord with the whip dropped it as if it were burning coals, his face a mask of ashen horror. The hall fell into a dead, terrified silence. He was their alpha, he was their king, and he was her mate. He turned, ignoring the cowering masses, and his eyes, now blazing with the silver fire of his wolf, found hers. The secret was out, and the war had just begun.
The world snapped back into focus with the force of a physical blow. The beggar who had held her hand in the moonlight, the quiet man whose gentle voice was her only sanctuary, was the Alpha King. Zevran. The power pouring from him was a living thing, a storm of silver light and raw dominance that pressed her down, that demanded submission, that declared his authority to the very heavens. She knelt with the others, not out of fear, but out of sheer, soul-shaking awe. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. It's him. It was always him. In that moment, a wild, dizzying hope erupted in her chest, so fierce it nearly choked her. Was this it? Was the nightmare over? But then the nobles began to stir. They rose slowly, shakily, their terror melting away into shrewd calculation. Lord Valerius, Celine's father, and a wolf whose ambition was as sharp as his teeth, was the first to speak. His voice was a low, respectful purr that didn't quite mask the steel beneath it. "My king," he said, bowing low. "We are overwhelmed. A miraculous bond, to be sure. But a bond with one of such low birth is unprecedented. The law, the sacred traditions, demand it be tested." The council murmured in agreement. Before Zevran could answer, Selene glided forward. She was a vision of midnight silk and diamonds, her beauty a sharp, glittering weapon. Her smile was honey over venom. "Of course, father is right," she said, her voice carrying through the silent hall. "But before the test, a purification. We must protect our king. We cannot risk a servant's taint on the Alpha's soul." The words were a direct slap, but her proposal sounded so pious, so reasonable. It was a perfect trap disguised as tradition. Her world tilted, the beautiful hope of a moment ago now trembling on a razor's edge. She locked eyes with Zevran, trying to pour all of her fear, all of her warning into that single glance. "Don't do it. Please. See the snake in the garden."
He felt invincible. The power of the Alpha surged through him, amplified by the pure, blazing certainty of the mate bond. Leandra, his Leandra, knelt among the others, her eyes wide with a beautiful, chaotic mix of fear and wonder. He had done it. He had claimed her. The rest of this was just politics. A final, pathetic squirming from the vipers in his court. He saw the demand for a test for what it was, a desperate gambit, and he saw Selene's suggestion for what it was, a petty final insult from a woman who had lost. So be it. He would allow it. He would allow their little ceremony because he wanted to see the looks on their faces when his bond with a humble servant proved purer and stronger than any of their high-born alliances. Their bond was etched in fate. What could a little ritual possibly do? "Very well," he declared, his voice booming with a confidence that left no room for argument. "Proceed with the purification, then we will have the test, and then this matter will be settled. Forever." As if summoned, Celine moved to his side, a ceremonial obsidian blade appearing in her hand. She was beautiful, he noted with a detached coldness, but it was the beauty of a frost-covered rose, perfect and deadly to the touch. She smiled at him, a flicker of something triumphant in her eyes that he dismissed as arrogance. She sliced her own palm first, the line of red a shocking slash against her pale skin. Before he could process what was happening, she grabbed his hand and pressed her bleeding palm against his, and his world exploded. It was not a holy light or a gentle cleansing. It was a violation. A vile, coiling darkness erupted from her hand, not just on his skin, but into his soul. It was a torrent of black, thorny vines that ripped and tore at the warm silver cord connecting him to Leandra. He felt her, felt their bond, being shredded. He cried out, a raw sound of agony, but the magic choked it in his throat. His wolf howled, a sound of pure spiritual torment that no one else could hear. Then came the cold. A chilling, artificial chain, smelling of lies and shadows, snaked around his soul and latched on. The pain stopped. In the quiet that followed, all he felt was a vast, echoing emptiness, and a strange, unquestioning loyalty to the woman whose hand was still locked in his. He saw a girl, a servant, rushing toward him, her face a mask of terror. She seemed familiar. A vague, painful memory he couldn't quite grasp.
The moment their hands touched, she saw it. A flicker of black light, a plume of oily black smoke that only she seemed to see, coiling around Zevran like a serpent. She saw him stagger, a silent scream tearing his face apart. Her heart skipped. No. No. This wasn't a ritual. This was an attack. Her body moved on instinct. "Stop it!" she cried, her voice raw with terror as she lunged forward. "That's not the ritual, it's a trick." She grabbed his arm, her small hands burning against his skin, trying to pull him back, to anchor him. "Please, it's me. Look at me." For one agonizing heartbeat, the world shifted. His eyes, clouded with pain, flickered with silver fire. He saw her. She knew he did. His lips parted as if to say her name. But then the false chains tightened. The light in his eyes died, swallowed by a cold, unsettling fog. His body stiffened. Slowly, painfully, he looked down at her hand on his arm as if it were a spider. Confusion flickered into a chilling emptiness, and he pulled away. The space between them burned with the brutal finality of his rejection. Gasps rippled through the hall, but they were not of shock this time. They were of understanding, of triumph. She saw his pain. She saw his confusion. She saw the stranger he had become in a single heartbeat. He turned from her, stumbling slightly, and took Celine's hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Celine's lips curled in a victorious smirk, and she pressed herself against his side. "The Alpha has chosen purity," she declared, her voice ringing with power. "The throne will not be tainted by a maid." The nobles erupted in applause, the sound a roaring wave that crashed over Leandra, drowning her. "No," she whispered, her vision blurring. Her knees buckled. "No, you don't mean this. You can feel it, can't you?" Tears broke free, her voice cracking in front of everyone. "You're my mate. Why are you letting them take us away?" But the king only turned his face aside, his jaw locked in a torment he could not name. Guards grabbed her arms again, but this time it was different. This time there was no hope of rescue. She was dragged backward, her cries echoing, her wolf howling inside her chest, until the sound became raw silence. And there, before the entire pack, the Alpha King walked away at Celine's side, leaving the only woman who had ever dared to reach for him, completely and utterly shattered.
His chambers, once a sanctuary, were now a cage. Celine was a constant presence, a beautiful poisonous flower perfuming the air with a scent that made his wolf sick. The magical chains around his soul told him this was right. They whispered that she was his mate, his Luna, his future. His mind, trapped in a dense fog, tried to believe it. He would look at her, so regal and confident, and he knew he should feel desire. He knew he should feel the pull of the bond, but all he felt was a cold, hollow wrongness, a deep, instinctual revulsion that had no name. At night, things were worse. He would lie beside her, a chasm of cold sheets between them, and he would dream. He dreamt of a girl with quiet courage in her eyes and scars on her hands. He couldn't remember her name. He couldn't remember her voice. But in the dream, she would reach for him, and for a fleeting moment, he would feel a warmth so profound it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. Then he would wake up, the feeling already fading, leaving behind a phantom ache, an agonizing sense of loss for someone he couldn't even name. Who was she? Why did the memory of a stranger feel more real than the woman sleeping beside him? Because of that, he could not bring himself to touch Celine. She would approach him, her lips curved in a seductive smile, and try to kiss him. But the moment her scent washed over him, his wolf would rise up, a silent, furious beast inside his mind. Not her. Never her. A growl would build in his chest, and he would have to physically turn away, forcing a cough or muttering an excuse about the stresses of the crown. He saw the flash of fury in her eyes each time, the tightening of her jaw. She knew he was resisting, and that only made the cage feel smaller, the air thinner. He was a king in his own castle, yet he was a prisoner in his own skin. To make things worse, a name, like a distant whisper on the wind, had begun to haunt the edges of his mind. A name that felt like hope, and tasted like regret.
Her world was the rough scrape of a brush against stone, the sting of lie in the cuts on her hands, and the dull, constant ache in her heart. She was on her hands and knees, scrubbing the flagstones of the great hall, the very spot where he had pulled away from her. Each circular motion was a torment, a memory, a humiliation. The bond, their beautiful, miraculous bond, was not gone. It was a cold, poisoned line stretched taut inside her chest. Sometimes, when she least expected it, it would pulse with a faint, sickening echo of him. With her. And she would have to bite her lip until it bled to prevent a scream from tearing out of her. For weeks, she existed in this gray, hopeless world. But then, a crack of light. While emptying trash bins near the council chambers, she overheard two nobles whispering. "The king is not himself," one said. "He is short-tempered, restless, and I hear he will not even let Lady Celine share his bed." The other laughed. Perhaps the little servant girl cursed him. The words were meant to be cruel, but to Leandra, they were a lifeline. He's fighting. The thought was a spark in the desolate winter of her soul. He hadn't forgotten. He was trapped, and he was fighting. As if the world narrowed, she knew what she had to do. She wasn't just a victim. She was a mate, and she would fight too. That night, she risked everything. She stole away from the servants' quarters and crept into the royal library. It was a vast, silent place, smelling of dust and ancient paper and forgotten truths. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Being found here meant instant execution. At the far end of the room, a single candle flickered. An old man, his back as bent as a question mark, was poring over a scroll. Elias, the keeper of records. He was ancient, cantankerous, and, as rumor had it, he despised the ambition of the highborn families. He was her only chance. Her voice trembled when she spoke his name. He looked up, his eyes like faded ink, sharp and suspicious. "What does a kitchen maid want with old books?" he rasped. She couldn't tell him the truth, not all of it. but she told him enough. "Lady Selene," she whispered, "the ritual she performed, it was not right. It felt like dark magic." Elias stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He had seen Celine's hunger for power his whole life. He had seen her dabble in things she shouldn't, and he saw the desperate, unbreakable truth in Leandra's eyes. "Wait here," he croaked. He shuffled away into a locked section of the archives. Moments later, he returned, carrying a heavy, leather-bound tome that seemed to drink the candlelight. He laid it on the table between them. "The old rites were blood magic, child," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Things that bind the body, but can never touch the soul."
The cracks were starting to show. Weeks of his wolf's relentless rebellion were taking their toll on the false bond. He was weaker, constantly exhausted, and his temper was a frayed wire. Celine's smile was perpetually strained, her touches becoming more demanding, more desperate. She knew she was losing her grip. The council, too, had started to whisper. "Why has the bond not settled? Why does our king look like a ghost?" They were questions Selene could not answer, and her frustration was making her sloppy. The breaking point came during a council meeting. He was listening to a report on the Shadowfen Pact's border movements, his mind a familiar fog, when Selene, sitting beside him, placed her hand on his arm in a gesture of possessive ownership. A growl rose in her throat. No, not her. A real audible growl ripped from his chest, low and feral, and full of violent promise. The entire council froze. Celine's eyes widened in shock. Without thinking, he shoved her hand away as if it were a venomous snake, his lip curled back from his teeth. In the ringing silence that followed, the violent act shattered the magical fog for a single stunning second. A face, a name, Leandra. Her name slammed into his consciousness like a bolt of lightning, and with it, the pure, warm silver feeling of their true bond flooded his soul. It was a breathtaking, agonizing instant of perfect clarity. He remembered her touch, her voice, her courage. As the silence roared, the fog came crashing back down, thick and suffocating. But it was too late. A crack had been ripped through the walls of his prison. He now had a name for the ghost that haunted him. He had a memory of the sun. He looked over at Selene, and though his mind was once again clouded, his soul knew her for what she was, a liar. Selene saw the change in his eyes. She saw the flicker of recognition, the memory of another, and the look on her face was not anger. It was pure, unadulterated terror. She knew, in that moment, that she was losing him. That's why she made a decision, her face hardening into a mask of cold, calculated resolve. If the chains were breaking, she would have to forge new ones that could never be broken.
For hours, they sat huddled over the ancient tome in the flickering candlelight, the world outside the dusty library forgotten. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and beeswax, and the only sound was the dry crackle of Elias turning a fragile page. Her hope was a wild, fragile thing, fluttering in her chest with every line of archaic text they deciphered. He was fighting for her. She knew he was, and she had to find a weapon for him. For them. She had to, because giving up was not an option. Not anymore. "Here!" Elias rasped, his gnarled finger jabbing at a faded illustration. "Look!" As if pulled by a string, she leaned closer. The drawing depicted a wolf with black, thorny vines wrapped around its heart, and a second wolf bathed in moonlight howling at it. The text was archaic, the letters twisted like grasping roots, but the meaning was terrifyingly clear. Sanguis vinculum, the blood bond. It was not a sacred rite, it was forbidden sorcery, a parasite that bound the body and clouded the mind. But, and her heart leaped, it could not destroy the soul's true mate bond. A beat later, her eyes found the counter-ritual. It was dangerous. It was public. The true mate had to step into the circle, denounce the lie for all to hear, and use the power of their own bond to call to the Alpha's trapped wolf. The Alpha's primal self, upon hearing its true mate, would then have the strength to shatter the false chains from within. Hope, pure and blinding, exploded in her chest. She had it. She had the key. "Elias, this is it," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "We can save him! I can—" Boom, 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 badoom! The sudden sound of royal trumpets from the main courtyard shattered the library's sacred silence. They stared at each other in confusion. Without thinking, Leandra scrambled to the narrow window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Below, the courtyard was a flurry of activity. A royal crier, dressed in the king's silver and black, unrolled a massive scroll. "Hear ye," his voice boomed. "In his wisdom and love for his Luna, our Alpha King Zevran decrees that a second, final, and binding ceremony shall be held this very night, to celebrate their settled bond and secure the future of the pack." The words hit her like a physical blow. The hope, so bright and beautiful a moment ago, turned to cold, heavy ash in her mouth. She looked down at the scroll in her hands, the key to his freedom, and then she looked at the courtyard, where they were already hanging lanterns for a celebration of his final enslavement. Truth be told, she didn't know how she could possibly fight a magic that moved faster than the truth itself.
He was so tired. The fire of his wolf, the raging beast that had fought and snarled and clawed for its freedom, was now just a bed of dying embers. The constant battle against the cloying wrongness of Selene, against the fog in his mind, had worn him down to nothing. He sat in his chambers while she hummed, laying out a ceremonial tunic of black and silver. She was preparing him for something. Another performance. He no longer had the strength to care. "Just a small ritual to prepare you, my love," she said, her voice a sweet, cloying poison. "To ensure our souls are perfectly aligned for the celebration tonight." She approached him with a small obsidian bowl. Inside was a dark, shimmering liquid that smelled of iron and nightshade. He should have fought. He knew on some deep, buried level that he should have fought, but the will to do so was gone. He was an empty vessel, a hollowed-out log, and the tide was coming in. He let her take his hand. He let her murmur the strange, sibilant words. He let her press the rim of the bowl to his lips. The liquid was cold and viscous, sliding down his throat like liquid night. What followed was not a violent tearing like the first time. It was a slow, suffocating flood, a tide of thick, black sludge that poured into his mind, smothering the last of the embers. He felt his wolf, his proud, silver wolf, give a final, mournful whimper before it was submerged, its light extinguished. Silence. For the first time in weeks, there was a perfect, absolute silence in his soul. The ache was gone. The restlessness was gone. The haunting memory of a girl with brave eyes was gone. He tried to grasp for her name, the one that had been his anchor. Lion. It dissolved like smoke, leaving nothing behind. In the stillness that followed, he felt nothing. The emptiness was no longer a painful void, it was just a state of being. He was a beautiful, empty room. When Selene took his hand, her touch was no longer revolting. It was simply a fact. Her smile was a fact. Her beauty was a fact. Her ownership of him was a fact. "It is time, my king," she whispered, her eyes glittering with a victory so complete it was absolute. And he rose, a perfect, handsome puppet, and followed her out of the room. He followed because there was no other path left to follow.
The courtyard pulsed with a life that felt like a funeral. Lanterns cast a warm, golden glow on the faces of the laughing, cheering nobles. Music played, wine flowed. They were celebrating his final damnation, and they didn't even know it. Leandra hid in the deepest shadows of a stone archway, the ancient scrolls clutched in her hand so tightly her knuckles were white. The paper felt brittle and useless. Her plan, so brilliant and hopeful in the dusty silence of the library, now felt like a child's fantasy. How could she fight this? And then she saw him. He walked at Selene's side, a king in both form and bearing. He was magnificent in his black and silver tunic, the moonlight catching the lines of his handsome face. He was a perfect, beautiful, breathtaking statue because his eyes were hollow, utterly, terrifyingly empty. As he passed her hiding spot, his head turned. For one heart-stopping, agonizing second, his vacant gaze passed directly over her. Nothing. Not a flicker. Not a spark. Not a hint of recognition. He looked right through her as if she were nothing more than the stone and shadow she was hiding in. Her breath caught. The man who had found her in the dark, the man who had tended her wounds, the man whose soul had called to hers, was gone. He was not just trapped. He was erased. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted, and all the fight, all the hope, all the desperate love that had fueled her drained away, leaving her as empty as he was. Her deepest fear, the one that whispered to her in the dark, had come true. She was just a foolish servant girl. She had failed him. She had lost. As the silence roared in her own mind, Celine, glowing with triumph, led him to the center of the circle. She raised her hands to begin the final binding chant, her voice ringing out in the festive air. Leandra stood frozen, the truth a dead weight in her hands, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. It was over. It was over. The thought was a cold, flat stone in the pit of her stomach. He was gone. Celine's voice, a melodic, triumphant drone, washed over the courtyard, weaving the final threads of his cage. The scrolls in Leandra's hand felt like a fool's last will and testament, full of truths that had died before they could be spoken. She should run. She should turn and melt back into the shadows, accept her fate as a ghost, and let the man she loved be erased forever. Her body, heavy with despair, prepared to obey. But then, something inside her shifted. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a decision. It was a growl. Deep in her soul, her wolf, the quiet, submissive creature that had endured a lifetime of slights and sorrows, rose up. It rose up not with a whimper, but with a snarl of pure, possessive, primal rage. Mine! The word was not a whisper. It was a silent, soul-shaking roar that vibrated through her bones. He is not hers to take. He is mine. As if in answer, she felt it. A desperate, frantic flicker from the poisoned bond. A tiny, buried spark of him, fighting against the crushing darkness. He wasn't gone. He was buried alive. In that moment, the despair didn't just fade. It was incinerated by a white-hot fury. Love was no longer a gentle ache. It was a declaration of war. She looked at Celine, her face serene and victorious, and she no longer saw a rival. She saw a thief, a soul thief. She looked at Zevran, his beautiful face an empty mask, and she no longer felt pity. She felt a fierce, unwavering purpose. She was not here to save him. She was here to reclaim him. Without another thought, she stepped out of the shadows. The golden lantern light felt like a spotlight on a stage. The chanting faltered. The music died. A collective gasp, sharp and sudden, sucked the air from the courtyard. The disgraced servant girl was standing in the center of the circle, her face a mask of defiant fury.
He was floating. The black, silent sea of his mind was peaceful, calm. The distant sound of Celine's voice was a lullaby, meaningless and soothing. He was aware of his body standing, of the cool night air on his skin. But these were distant facts. They had nothing to do with him. He felt nothing. He wanted nothing. He was at peace, a perfect hollow peace. But then, a new sound, a different voice. It wasn't loud, it wasn't a shout, yet it sliced through the black sludge of his mind like a shard of pure silver starlight. That ritual is false. The words were clear. They were an anchor in the void, and they were followed by more. You are not bound to her. You never were. As if the world narrowed, the voice grew stronger, pulling him from the depths. You belong to me, as I belong to you. Me. The word was a key turning a lock that had rusted shut. The silent, submerged wolf in the abyss of his soul heard it. Its silver eyes snapped open. It knew that voice. Mate. The recognition was not a thought. It was an explosion. A silent roar of earth-shattering power erupted inside his skull, and the peaceful Black Sea was instantly a raging whirlpool. The thorny vines of the false bond, the chains that had held him in blissful emptiness, groaned and strained as if they were made of glass. A searing pain ripped through him, but this pain was life. It was the feeling of a soul clawing its way back from the grave. He could feel her. That spark. That warmth. It was still there. Selene must have felt the shift. Her chanting grew louder, more desperate, trying to shove him back down into the comforting darkness. He felt the sludge begin to rise again to cloud his thoughts. But it was too late. He heard his mate's voice one more time, a desperate, loving cry. And that was all his wolf needed. It was awake. And it was absolutely, apocalyptically, furious.
She raised the scrolls, her hand trembling not with fear but with adrenaline. "This ritual is a lie. You are bound by sorcery, not fate," she cried, her voice ringing with a power she didn't know she possessed. Selene actually laughed, a high, sharp sound of disbelief. "A maid dares to speak of bonds?" She clutched Zevran's arm, her knuckles white. "Ignore her, my love. Let us finish this." She began her chant again, her voice a venomous hiss. But then it happened. A sound, low and guttural, ripped from Zevran's chest. It was the sound of a cage breaking. His body convulsed, his head thrown back in a silent scream. And then a real roar, a sound of pure, untamed alpha power, shook the very stones of the courtyard. The nobles screamed. His bones cracked and reformed with sickening speed. Black fur erupted across his skin. His wolf, massive and black as a starless midnight, exploded from within him in a violent, uncontrolled shift of pure rage. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, the primal call of her mate was a command she could not deny. Her own wolf, finally unleashed, surged forward. In a dizzying, weightless shimmer of moonlight, her own bones broke and reformed. She was a wolf. A sleek silver wolf, her fur glowing like a beacon in the night. The crowd screamed again, a mixture of terror and utter disbelief. A servant with such a strong wolf? It was impossible. She ignored them. There was only him. Their two wolves, one of shadow, one of light, circled each other in the center of the courtyard. Their bond marks, long, dormant, and cold, now blazed on their fur like living fire. A searing silver brand on his midnight coat, a shadow of a crown on her silver one. As the truth unraveled, Selene shrieked, a raw sound of pure fury and pain as she clutched her chest, feeling the false bond begin to snap like rotten thread. And at that exact moment, Elias, the old record keeper, stepped from the crowd. He held the ancient open tome high for the council to see, its pages illuminated by the lantern light. "She speaks the truth!" he bellowed, his old voice cracking with righteous power. "The king has been bound by lies. This was no Luna's bond. It was sorcery."
The world was a chaotic storm of sound and fury, but inside his wolf's mind, there was only a single point of silver light. Her, his mate. The rage that had fueled his transformation melted away, replaced by a profound instinctual need to be near her, to protect her, to confirm that she was real. His massive black wolf form moved with a grace that defied its size, closing the distance between them until he could breathe in her scent, moonflowers, and a courage that humbled him. As his muzzle gently touched hers, something inside his soul snapped. Crack. The false bond didn't fade, it shattered like black glass. A searing pain ripped through him, but it was a cleansing fire, incinerating the last of Selene's foul magic. The black sludge evaporated from his soul, leaving him raw, exposed, and finally, free. As the magic broke, the memories of the past weeks came flooding back in a horrific, crushing wave. His coldness, his rejection of her, the vacant look in his own eyes as he walked away at Selene's side. A shame so profound it almost brought him to his knees washed over him. How could she ever forgive him? He shifted, his body aching and trembling from the ordeal, reforming into his human skin. The first thing he saw was Selene, her face a twisted mask of shrieking fury as the guards, now loyal only to their true alpha, seized her. Lord Valerius was on his knees begging for mercy, but Zevran had eyes for only one person, Lyandra. She stood across from him, also back in her human form, looking fragile and overwhelmed in the sudden ringing silence. He crossed the space between them, his every step an apology, a prayer. He took her hand, the same hand he had pulled away from, an act that would haunt him for the rest of his days. And he turned to face his pack, his voice cracking with an emotion he would never again hide. She asked if I was okay with her being my mate, he said, his voice raw but carrying to every corner of the courtyard. I am not only okay. He paused, his gaze finding hers, pouring all of his shattered, healing soul into her eyes. I am nothing without her. Between one breath and the next, the world ignited. A blinding flash of silver and black light erupted from their joined hands, the raw, untamed power of their true bond sealing itself before the entire pack. It was the fire of creation, the light of two souls becoming one. And from the crowd, a single wolf howled, not in fear or fealty, but in pure, unadulterated awe. Then another joined, and another, until the night air rang with the unified, reverent song of the Silver Moon Pack.
The following night was the Luna's Path. The ceremony she had once thought would be her final humiliation was now her coronation. She walked not on trembling legs, but with a quiet, steady strength she hadn't known she possessed. The heavy ceremonial cloak of the Luna, woven from the silver fur of past queens, rested on her shoulders, and it did not feel like a costume. It felt like a homecoming. She was no longer the invisible kitchen mouse. She was the alpha's mate. She was the heart of the pack. She was Luna Lyandra. As she walked the moonlit path, she met the eyes of the nobles who had once scorned her. Lady Anya, Lord Valerius's allies. They all bowed their heads. She saw no contempt in their gazes now. In its place she saw shame, she saw awe, and in a few she saw a glimmer of genuine respect. She did not gloat. Her heart was too full for such petty things. She simply inclined her head, accepting their fealty with a grace she had learned in the quiet moments of her life, not in a classroom for nobles. She had earned this, not through birthright or ambition, but through a simple act of compassion that had unraveled the world. Zevran waited for her at the end of the path, on the dais before the great heart tree of their people. He was not dressed in the intimidating armor of an alpha king, but in a simple black tunic. His eyes held no trace of the hollow stranger he had been forced to become. They were filled only with a love so deep and profound it made her breath catch. This was her mate. This was the man whose soul she had seen even through rags. When she reached him, he took her hand, and together they turned to the pack. As if on cue, they both shifted. His wolf, a magnificent creature of midnight and power, stood beside her own, a wolf of moonlight and resilience, and together they lifted their heads to the sky and howled. The sound was not a declaration of power, but a song of unity, a promise. And as the entire pack answered, their voices joining in a single, powerful chorus, she finally understood. She wasn't just his mate, she was theirs, and she was finally, truly, home.
Later that night, long after the celebrations had faded and a quiet peace had settled over the palace, they stood alone. On the highest balcony, under the silent, watchful eye of the full moon, there were no crowns, no cloaks, no titles. There was only Zevran and Lyandra. The cool night air washed over them, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of a lone wolf singing to the sky. He had spent the entire night watching her, his heart a painful, swelling thing in his chest. How could he ever deserve a creature of such strength and grace? He finally found his voice, a quiet whisper in the stillness. I am so sorry, Lyandra. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the pale, tangled scars on her hands. He no longer saw them as marks of servitude. He saw them as a testament to her endurance, to the pain she had borne long before she had ever met him. You endured all of that. You were hurt and shamed and terrified, all because of my pride, my blindness. She turned to him, her eyes shining in the moonlight, and placed her scarred hand over his heart. You were trapped, Zevran. I never once blamed you. But I blame myself, he breathed, his voice cracking. I was so focused on finding someone to see past the king that I never prepared for what would happen when someone actually did. He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. You saved me when I was most lost. You fought for me when I couldn't even fight for myself. You gave me something this throne, this power, this entire kingdom never could. And what is that? She whispered, her breath warm against his lips. A reason, he said simply. You are my reason. And when he kissed her, it was not with the desperation of their stolen moments in the garden, but with the slow, deep, and certain promise of 1,000 sunrises and a shared eternity. Her soul answered his, their bond a warm, steady, and unbreakable presence between them. Below, their wolves rested at their feet, one of shadow, one of light, finally at peace. For the first time in his life, he was not alone. And for the first time in hers, she was not just accepted, but cherished. Together they would rule, not with fear or by tradition, but with a love that had defied a curse and remade the world.